Charles Leclerc says that he used to stand out in wet races in junior categories, and that was his speciality. He says that none of the Ferraris he's driven gives him any feel in the wet, and it's so difficult to drive. Well, yeah, I mean, he was always fabulous in the wet. I remember seeing him a couple of times in Formula 3 or GP3, whatever it was, and he was really, really good. As you'd expect anybody with that sort of touch and that sort of feel and their ability to drive, to create a huge, by the standards of many drivers, a huge sweet spot around which he can play with all the variables. He's just got this wonderful feel for the right rotation point. And yeah, he makes a lot of mistakes, and he is a more emotional driver than Max, and he's more emotional than most, actually. And he does make errors because he's always pushing it. But usually, not always, but usually the errors are in practice and sometimes Saturdays, not usually the race. I mean, Abu Dhabi was a classic example of a great race by Charles Leclerc, I thought. But it's a shame, Mark, isn't it, that none of the Ferraris he's driven given him any feel in the wet.
I suspect it's to do with the stiffness that they have to run that car at in order to extract the downforce. From what I understand over the last few years, obviously we had a bit of an association at Haas with Ferrari, and the way the suspension they provided us to use was suspension that wanted to be run very stiff, almost in all regions, which wasn't appropriate to our car. Our car actually didn't need to be stiff. In other words, we didn't gain much downforce by making the car stiffer, which was actually a problem in a way. But at least it meant that our car had a bit of progression, certainly the 24 car, not so much the 23 car. That was just bad in almost every respect. So I do wonder if it's to do with that level of stiffness that they're having to run the car at, and it just makes the car... well, I think they struggle for downforce. I think that the tyres, they have a very narrow temperature range, the Pirelli wets, and small slides can push you over the edge, or you don't get enough temperature. So I think that's another difficulty. And I suspect for him, if the car's very snappy, he probably can't feel the limit of grip. I guess that's what he's feeling about. He's not feeling where the edge of performance is. And on top of all that, the front tyres of the Pirellis is certainly true of the dries, and I think it's probably true to some extent with the wets, is that the front end has very poor lateral grip performance. So it's very difficult to find the balance and the grip on those tyres.
I think it was Miami. He went off on the formation lap for the sprint race. Is that right? In the wet? I think he did. I mean, it was aquaplaning, admittedly, but very unusual to see a driver do that.
And Hadjar in Melbourne, when he went off in the damp, I guess, maybe more to do with inexperience, but I think they are very difficult tyres to drive.
The other problem is that we actually don't have that much wet racing now, do we? And wet driving. I mean, so from Ferrari's point of view, they're never going to think about a car that's going to be good in the wet. They're only going to think about maximum pace in the dry. Yeah. But it's interesting to hear you talk about the stiffness of the Ferrari setup. And it kind of makes me think of, dare I say, the old days when the ultimate racing car was very stiff chassis, but very compliant soft suspension. And that applied to road cars, still applies to road cars today, really, Lotus Elan. But it certainly applies to racing cars. And that was Colin Chapman's thing. And today it's not unlike that, except that instead of having the super stiff chassis, which everybody has, it's now what the perfect compromise, correct me if I'm wrong here, is to have some compliance in the suspension without having to go super low and stiff with the car in order to get the aero. If you've got the aero downforce that you require, and you can then run a little bit more compliant and make the car a little bit over curbs, that's nirvana. And that, of course, is somewhere near where McLaren have been this year.
Yeah, it's a compromise, and ultimately, if the track is completely smooth and no curbs, then you would run the car completely rigid, and the only compliance would come from the tyres and any flexing of the suspension, which isn't wanted, but it's inevitably you have some in it. But as soon as you have the odd bump or curb, then you need a degree of compliance to allow the car to absorb that. And that's the balancing act. So you're always basically trying to run the car as stiff as you can whilst balancing against that bumps and the issue of bumps and curbs. And then it depends which range that the bumps are in. So one of the analysis that would be done prior to an event and during an event is where in the speed range the bumps actually are, and you'd be tuning the stiffness, because the stiffness is not linear. You tend to have rising rates for the front and rear suspension through a variety of geometry, and through the springing medium will have probably steps in it, which can be achieved from having torsion bars with multiple steps in them that engage at different points, but also through engaging either bump rubber or Belleville stacks to tune stiffness at different speeds. And that really is what you spend a lot of the time doing, to get the car as low as you can, but without engaging stiffness where you don't want it. And interestingly, the bouncing that you often see, and that we've had Max complaining about a couple of races, and obviously McLaren had a problem with in Vegas, that tends to be the stiffness of the car at high speed. And if you have it too stiff, such that a bump sets off the aerodynamic instability that you get with the car sort of coming down, creating lots of downforce and then getting too low and that downforce going, then you get into an aerodynamic instability, because it's often triggered by being a bit too stiff at a critical point. And we often used to find that we'd actually have to soften the car off at the highest speed in order to avoid that instability being set up. And if you don't have bouncing, you can actually run the car a bit lower, because obviously if the car's bouncing, you're going through a wider range of ride height, and it could be both lower and higher. So the points where it's low is where it's wearing the skids. So you're actually better off being a bit softer. But it's predicting these things that is one of the main elements that the teams are doing through a race weekend. And obviously, and it seemed like in the last couple of races, Red Bull were probably a bit too aggressive with that, and Max was complaining of bouncing. And then presumably they probably did something like soften it off, or just maybe doing something aerodynamically with their car is the other possibility to reduce that effect.
And we're assuming that in 26 it'll be completely different, right? Because the floor
is going to be much less sensitive to ride height, and you won't get the same instability developing. So yeah, it will help that, and that will mean, it should mean that the teams are able to run the cars somewhat softer. There will still be an element of gain from ride height, and there are other benefits from being low ride height as well, in terms of center of gravity height being lower, and that's easier on the tires. So they'll still want to run their cars low, but it won't be quite as critical as it was this year, particularly at the rear. The front may still be similar, but it's the rear, it's the sort of middle to rear of the car where it's been super critical in this period.